All right, so hello everyone. Thanks to those of you who are joining live. I appreciate you taking the time. Those of you who are watching the recording, I also appreciate you taking the time to view it. Welcome to Poliventure. This is our Wednesday night workshops. So recall that this workshop is about basically looking at games and how they can relate to concepts in political science. In weeks 1 through 4, we covered some core concepts, and we'll review those again this week, and we'll jump right to it. So for week 6, it's called Bluff. So our objectives with this workshop are the following. First is to define signals and bluffs. Secondly is to explain how signals and bluffs are related. And then lastly, to apply signals and bluffs to the game of Stratego or Stratego. So there was 4 concepts that we started with Poliventure, and that was communication, information, strategy, and moves. And over the past few weeks, I've been adding additional concepts to build out the complexity that comes with both the games that we're observing or participating in, and or how they relate to politics and to political science. So for communication, direct or indirect, information complete, incomplete, strategy is cooperative or competitive. Moves can be simultaneous, which means at the same time, or sequential, which is one after the other. We added the 5th concept of network, which can show things can be a simple connection between different actors, institutions, countries, etc., or complex. In week 5, which I have yet to record, is about probability, which is high or low. Basically, it means that can something happen? Is there a high probability of happening, or is there a low probability of something happening? And then lastly, and this week, I'm introducing a 7th concept, which is signals. And signals can be either more clear or less clear. So a few definitions to get us started. The first one is a signal, right? So signal is a gesture, action, or sound that is used to convey information or instructions, typically by prearrangement between the parties concerned. So this is our textbook, or this is our dictionary definition of a signal. Now, our dictionary definition of a bluff is an attempt to deceive someone into believing that one can or will do something. 2 other definitions we want to fix in our mind is sender. So this is a player, a political actor who would be sending a signal. And then the receiver is a player, political actor who would be receiving that signal. Now, you might be asking, okay, how does this all connect together? So let's talk about that for a bit. So signals by themselves, right, is just something that's being communicated, right? But we can give that signal a value or an attribute, right? A characteristic of a signal. And most of the time, signals can either be clear or they can be unclear, or they can be more clear, they can be less clear. Now you might be asking, okay, what's a couple of examples of a signal? Like the simplest one is a lighthouse. So imagine you're on this ship in the dark of the ocean, you're coming towards the shore. You want the lighthouse as a signal to let you know that you're approaching the shoreline. So you want to either change your direction so you don't crash and sink on the rocks of the coastline. Now imagine that the lighthouse was very, very bright. And if it's very, very bright, you would say that's a clear signal. That's a very clear signal because you can see the light and giving you that warning. Now you might have a lighthouse that's a little old and the light bulb, which are pretty big, these giant light bulbs, it might be a little dim. And this might be coming back to this coastline after, a year or 2 of being out at sea. You might say, you know what, that lighthouse, it's not that clear. It's less clear than I remember it from 2 years ago, right? So the same lighthouse sending a signal, but one of those signals, 2 years prior is very clear because the light bulb is very bright and shiny. And then it's less clear 2 years later because the light bulb's dimming. Now, these signals, right, in a boat sense, you're like, okay, what about politics? Well, in politics, you might have politicians who will communicate things very clearly. So they'll send a very clear signal. So for example, today in the news, this week in the news, Speaker Pelosi announced that the commission to investigate the January 6th insurrection on the Capitol was going to start to organize. And then the minority leader, Kevin McCarthy, said, here's the 5 or 6 people from their party that he wants on the committee. Now, within less than 12 hours, Speaker Pelosi sent a very clear signal that she is going to reject 2 of these 5 or 6 people that were recommended by the minority leader. And then within an hour or two of that statement, the minority leader came back out and says, well, we're going to withdraw all of the people from the committee, from our party, for a variety of reasons. And so that's a game of signaling between politicians. Now, imagine that this happened a little differently, where you had Speaker Pelosi say, we're having this commission being organized, and then the minority leader waited a little bit and then said, here's our people. And then Speaker Pelosi waited a day, a 2, 3, 4, or a week, say before the first meeting of this commission, which is scheduled for July 27th or 28th, so in about a week. Imagine she delayed 7 days. So we wouldn't even be talking about this right now, but people wouldn't have been all worked up and riled up as they are today. And they'll probably be for the rest of the week about this decision, that these decisions that are being made by the speaker and the minority leader with respect to this body. So in this case, it's an example of very clear communication between politicians, but there are many instances where the communication is not very clear. So 2 big questions that we want to ask ourselves with respect to signals is when is a more clear signal informative, and when is a less clear signal informative? You might be asking, okay, that sounds like it's the same thing, but it's not. Sometimes signals that are very clear are very informative. So the lighthouse being very bright, that's very informative. If the lighthouse is dim, so the signal is less clear that it's sending, some people say, oh, that's not very clear, right? Or it's not very informative, right? If you're the captain of a ship, you're like, I can't see the coastline as well because the lighthouse isn't as bright. But it would be a very informative signal to suggest to you that I need to call the lighthouse operator like right now or tomorrow morning and say, hey, your bulb's out, your bulb's going out, you need to go fix it. So depending on who the signal is being sent to, it can be informative or less informative, given the nature or given the clarity of the signal itself. So it's just something to keep in mind, that signals aren't as simple as like, oh, it's there or it's not, right? That there's some structure behind it that can be used in games and in politics. Now, this next concept are bluffs. And bluffs are probably more familiar to you because you've probably played card games like Go Fish or poker or some other kind of card game, unless you played 52 card pickup, which for those of you who know what game that is, it's sad and funny at the same time, depending on which end of the pickup you're on. But for the most part, if you played card games or any games where you have to basically not communicate completely all the time, then you're probably bluffing. So a bluff, again, is an attempt to deceive someone into believing that one can or will do something. Now, in a game, a bluff is a message from a sender that is essentially not 100% correct. Now, the receiver has to determine the likelihood of the bluff with some probability ranging from 0 to 1. So, for example, imagine that I had a deck of cards in front of me, which I will mimic with this Post-it note. And we all had Post-it notes in front of us. And I can either have written down an even number or an odd number on this Post-it note. So imagine I would say, okay, I have my Post-it note, you have yours, the other person does, the other person does. So let's say the 4 of us all have a Post-it note. And then we have to decide who for each person has either an odd or even number. Now, for our first game, we all will probably guess, like, okay, Dr. Franco, you have an odd. Kenneth, you have an even. Claire, you have an odd. Sarah, you have an even. And then we would all have to reveal, whether we wrote an odd or even number on our card. Now, that first round of information, it's not a very clear signal, but it's informative, because what will happen is like, oh, okay, so I was paying attention to, let's say, Kenneth and how he was like reacting when I said even or odd, and he had like this little like blink in his eye when I said odd, and then when he showed his card, he was actually an even number. And I'm like, I wonder if that blinking of the eye is indicating of something. Or maybe Kenneth noticed like Claire, like a twitch in her nose when she like heard odd. And then when she showed her card, it was an odd number. And then Kenneth's thinking, oh, well, that twitch in her nose, maybe that's when like, when she hears information that's verifying what it is. So now I think I know how she's reacting. And then Sarah could do, the same assessment of one of us or all of us. So after we play that first game, we're starting to build our knowledge of the other player. And now we're starting to speculate what their bluff is and how they bluff and when they bluff and what that all means. So our understanding of how they bluff starts to fill in what we expect to happen or the probability that of someone's bluffing or not. And then you start to say, okay, well, once I figure out that every time Dr. Franco wiggles his glasses like this, that he has an odd number. Now imagine that we play this game 3, 4, 5, 10, 100 times, and you guys start to figure out when I always play an odd number. I start to think to myself, how do they always know when I'm playing an odd number? And I think about it. I watch the recording from this workshop and I'm like, they figured it out. I figured it out too. Every time I wiggle my glasses is when I have an odd number. Now I know that, right? So then we come back a day or two or a week later and we're going to play this game again. And I know that when I wiggle my glasses that you all think that I have an odd number. And to all of you, that's a very clear signal that should be very informative. But then what happens? I know that. So then I wiggle my glasses, even though I have an even number. And then when I play it, I win. And they're like, oh. And it might take you 1, 2, 3, 4, 100 games to realize, like, wait a minute, Dr. Franco probably knows that we know that when he wiggles his glasses, he has an odd number, but now he's bluffing so that we lose the game. And now we go through this process all over again. So bluffs are a very dynamic way of signaling and knowing when you're signaling and knowing when you're not signaling. And then this learning process has to happen over time between players interacting repeatedly. So an example of all this, there's a game called Stratego or Stratego, depending on how you want to say it. And I'll go ahead and play a short clip about how we play this game. And then we'll talk about it for a bit, or I'll give an example of it, and then we'll have our discussion. So let me go ahead and open up this video. And there might be an ad with this, so we'll have to wait a moment or two. Yeah, it looks like there's a Disney Plus ad for Luca. I'll go ahead and mute it for a moment. And I'm going to put myself on mute so that the audio doesn't interrupt each other. So we'll go ahead and skip the ad. And if you can just give a thumbs up that you can hear it, that'd be great.
Hi, my name is Sebastian, and I walk you through the basics of Stratego Online. We offer 4 types of play. You can play alone against the computer. You can do a quick play against a random opponent. You can play ranked, that means that if you win points, and if you lose points. And you can invite a friend to play. Let's see who's online. My friend Dennis is online, and I'm gonna ask him if he wants to play a game with me. Here I can choose if I want to play a quick game with 10 pieces, or if I want to play a full game with 40 pieces. For this tutorial, I'll choose a quick play. Dennis accepted the challenge, and now we can start setting up the game. This is the versus screen. In this screen you can see your own statistics, the statistics of your opponent, and you have the chance to customize the piece team and the battlefield. If you're happy with what you're seeing, just click ready to go to the next step. This is the plan your setup step. Now the goal of the game is to capture the flag of your opponent. This means that your opponent wants to capture your flag too, so protect it well. I'm just gonna put my pieces on the board randomly and tell you more about what they do while we're playing the game. The more you play the game, the more you probably know where you want to set your pieces. In that case, you can also choose save your setup and also to load your setups that you made before. If you are ready with your setup, then click ready to start the game. Here you can see my pieces in play the way I've set them up in the step before we started. Across the board are Dennis's pieces. I have to find his flag. If you want to know more about the piece, just click on the piece and then you can see his rank and what it does under the screen. The scout has a special ability. It can move any number of steps, either horizontal or vertical. The other pieces can only set one step every time. You just saw that Dennis's scout encountered one of my bombs. If a piece encounters a bomb, it will be removed from the board. The only piece that can defuse a bomb is the miner. You just saw that Dennis's general captured my scout. His general is rank 9. The higher the rank, the more powerful a piece is. If pieces of the same rank hit each other, they are both removed from the board. My general was just captured by Dennis's marshal. Now the marshal is the highest ranked piece in play. It can only be defeated if the spy catches the marshal. The spy, on the other hand, is the lowest ranked piece in play. It can be captured by any moving piece. I've captured Dennis's flag. And now you see the victory screen with some more information about the game we just played. We just gave you a quick overview with the 10 to 10 game, but the 40 to 40 game is still awaiting you.
So that's the game, Stratego. And I think it's apparent that how you would play this game like in one setting, but if you're repeatedly playing this game with someone else, how the notions of signaling and bluffs would matter, right? So for example, if you see one of those pieces move more than two moves, you should know that it's a scout, which means it can move anywhere really quickly, but it has a certain level or certain strength. And then you would do that. So like, say, for example, Sarah and I were playing this game 10 times. The first few times we probably move the scouts because we're learning how to play the game. But in games 4, 5, 6, and 7, we would realize that maybe we shouldn't move the scout as much, because once you move it too much, now you've signaled that this piece that's not known by the other player is a scout based on the actions of that piece, as opposed to turning it face up. Now, in the last few games that we would play, so games 8, 9, and 10, Sarah might say, well, Dr. Franco over there, he always seems to be keen on this scout moving, so I'm not going to move him as much. And then when the time comes, I'll move him so that I can get them in the right position to take over one of the other pieces. And me not knowing this, obviously, I'm like, oh, wow, I wasn't expecting Sarah to make that move, because she normally makes a particular move. So you have these notions of signals and bluffs being played in this game, but they're only useful when you're playing multiple times with the same other player, because then you start to learn how they go about processing information. So what I like to do to conclude is basically answer this question, which is, how does this relate to political science? Well, in politics, we're interested in how politicians, other political actors like interest groups, lobbying organizations, corporations, etc., anyone who's has an interest in public policy at the international, national, state, and the local level, how they go about making moves and how they go about signaling information and what that might mean. So for example, because of my experience working in government for an elected official, I'm pretty keen on what moves politicians would make based on their political interest or on their electoral ambitions that they may have. So anytime I notice local politicians talking more about federal issues or talking about more about state issues, I'm like, okay, you're probably interested in running for either a state office or a federal office. And it's just something that you become aware of, because they're sending signals to the untrained or to the unexperienced eye. They're like, oh, okay, it's just a politician, a mayor, an assembly member, a statewide official. They're just doing what they're doing. But if you are an observer of politics, you can say, I wonder why this person is going from this area to that area. So to tie it back into the public policy project that you have for this week, you're talking about different policy areas and issues. As you learn about these different areas, you might say, okay, I really want to focus in on this. So students who might emphasize the federal level might have an interest in national/federal issues, and that might be a better place for them to focus their time, energy, and efforts. Some students might say, I'm really interested in the local level, which might indicate to me as someone like maybe one day they're going to run for mayor of the city of El Cajon, or they're going to run for city council of Lemon Grove, because they have a real keen interest in what's happening in their communities. And so when you think about signals, the actions, the statements people make, the actions people take can be signals to inform you about something that they're going to do. And it doesn't just apply to politics, and apply to other areas as well. So for example, let's say that you are very high ranked in your high school and you're like close to being valedictorian, or that you're not sure who valedictorian is, and that you notice the person who might be the valedictorian like decides to go play 10 sports. And you're like, well, I know that they can't get extra, GPA points for playing a sport. So maybe they weren't the valedictorian to begin with, right? Or maybe they realize that they want to go do something else. So if you have that kind of competitive nature, which I know in my high school, we had two top folks, and they were like battling it out to who got the highest GPA. And it came down to like who played tennis and who didn't play tennis. It was like pretty interesting, but that can be a signal, right? It's like, okay, I guess they're going in another direction, so I don't have to be worried about that. Or same thing with in employment situations and the like. So I just want to I'll leave it at that. We'll go ahead and stop the recording and have our discussion. So thanks to those of you who watched, and for those of you who attended.